Hey guys, it's Dani. Welcome to a new season from our Orchid Care for Beginners series. We have been renewed for another year, and this, I do believe, is our 6th season. Wow. Can we have any more discussions about orchids? Of course we can, of course. So this year, I want to focus on the long-term and sustainable side of growing orchids. So this series will still be for beginners, nothing complicated, but we will be dealing a little bit more with the practical approach long-term so that we have an easy life with orchids, we don't overcomplicate things, and we have success year after year. I mean, my channel is around for almost 12 years now, and some of my orchids are 12 years old in my collection, some even longer. And that is absolutely achievable with your normal Phalaenopsis without being overwhelming, without requiring a ton of money, and so on. So we will focus on the best care that I can provide to you for long-term success. Right, so before we start, today's episode, of course, with this entire series has been and will be this year sponsored by rePotme.com, who offers you everything you could possibly need to properly take care of your orchids, from potting mixes, for which they're very famous for, to pots, fertilizers, accessories, and everything in between, even grow lights, and not only for orchids but also other houseplants as well. Their website has recently been revamped, so check it out down below. It looks very, very nice. I personally have been using their products for many years, hence why I've been keeping this collaboration going for so many years. So I can actually share with you down below some of my absolute favorite products, some that are absolutely essential, for me at least, and many of you know which product I'm talking about, for long-term success. And you know what? Today we're gonna start with that product, because why not? It is a great or important aspect of orchid growing long-term, and this is fertilizer. We're gonna demystify the whole fertilizing subject, and I'm gonna tell you my tips for achieving, orchids like mine. If you like my orchids, you like what I can achieve, then I'm gonna tell you how I do it. It's really simple. It actually is keeping it simple, but there are many things that I want to demystify. So I have my list because I don't even know where to start and I want to be coherent. First of all, let's start with, do orchids need fertilizer? You might see on social media, oh, I grow my orchids only with water and look how beautiful they are. Well, my friends, those orchids are not old. Yes, orchids, just like any other type of plant, they do need food, they need fertilizer. And while you might say, yes, they produce their own food through photosynthesis, they actually need those nutrients to properly breathe, properly form cell structure, properly make chlorophyll. There are many things that orchids need that cannot be provided only with water. At most, tap water will contain calcium and magnesium, but that's about it. Where is the nitrogen? Where is phosphorus, potassium, molybdenum, magnesium, boron, copper? Where are all these things? They're not. They need to be provided, and the easiest way to provide them is through the use of a fertilizer, and specifically an orchid fertilizer. I would not recommend using any other types of fertilizers like citrus fertilizers, tomato fertilizers, and so on, especially if you're at the beginning, because what they contain and what chemical form it's contained might not be suitable for orchids, which are epiphytic plants. They're not terrestrial plants. It differs a little bit, so especially if you're a beginner, and especially for long-term success, even if you're not a beginner, I would recommend using strictly orchid fertilizers, not like tomato fertilizers and things of the sorts. I personally, for all of these years, have never used like citrus fertilizers or whatever, anything else. I've only used orchid-intended fertilizers. So what type of fertilizer is the best for orchids? Well, obviously an orchid-intended fertilizer, but these are of many kinds, of course. My preferred fertilizer is what I like to call a full menu fertilizer, one that has as many nutrients, minerals, and everything orchids need in just one pack, because I don't need to supplement with other types of fertilizers. A few years ago, I don't know if they're still common nowadays, a few years ago people were going pretty wild with CalMag, calcium and magnesium, and I could maybe see the reason for that. Many fertilizers on the market, orchid intended fertilizers even, lack calcium and magnesium, because usually these things you can find in tap water. But not really, and not all the time, and not necessarily in the quantities and chemical forms that are the best. So people would supplement them. However, there are fertilizers on the market that do contain calcium, magnesium, nitrogen, all of the things you could need, and those are my preferred ones. The one that I've been using for like more than 6 years before my collaboration with rePotme is the MSU formula, which rePotme sells. They have. I don't know if there are any other brands that have the formula, but rePotme has the MSU fertilizer. It is rebranded now as the FeedMe MSU fertilizer. It is the same thing if you look at the chemical formula. And I have been using that like for 8 years or so. One of my viewers actually sent it to me because it's hard for me to get a hold of it here in Europe, but they sent it to me. I've used it, I loved it, and I had such good results without too much hassle with it, and I've been using it ever since. Of course, rePotme sent me new jars, which is great. If you're in the US, you have easy access to it, and that's like my staple fertilizer with orchids, and I don't use anything like to add more nutrients because that fertilizer has the entire list of fertilizers. So if there are any others on the market that have like a full menu, those are the best, and those are the ones that I would choose over your typical supermarket fertilizer. If you go at garden centers, flower shops, whatever, you see an orchid fertilizer and you look on the back, you will see they have the NPKs and maybe a few trace elements, but if you compare it to the label of the MSU, you'll see there are many things that are missing. Now, there's nothing wrong with using various fertilizers to meet all of the nutritional needs, but it's a hassle, isn't it? And since we're talking about sustainability, one of my biggest pet peeves is if things don't flow. If they are not done in accordance to a plan that I have in my head that I need to follow. OCD, right? I'm not joking. But yeah, I cannot be bothered to have 5 bottles and combine them. No, things need to flow and be efficient. So again, nothing wrong with combining fertilizers, not really combining them, but using them one after the other to meet the nutritional needs. But it's better to find one that has all of the nutritional needs that your orchid wants. Now let's talk about additives. On the market, you will find additives that contain B complex vitamins and maybe other stuff like amino acids or maybe some humic and fulvic acid. Those are all well and fine. I personally don't use them. One, I do not live in a country with a lot of diversity at my reach. I have to like really go out of my way to find these products. So I have never been really tempted to use them much because it's just a hassle to get my hands on them. And guess what? You don't need them. At least for the results that I get that you see in all of my videos, you know, I don't need those additives. I cannot really tell you if they will do much for your orchid since I haven't used them, so I don't have much experience with them. Throughout all of these years, I've used a few, let's say, additives or fertilizers that contain some of these additives, and quite frankly, I wasn't happy. I mean, not that I wasn't happy, I didn't see anything spectacular. I settled on the MSU because I did actually see results with my own eyeballs. So that's why I sat with it. But anything else, I didn't really see any positive impact that would make me go through the trouble of finding and sourcing all of these additives. Now, just for the fun and, you know, if you have the time and the resources and the money, you know, absolutely try them out and let us know in the comments how they're going. But for long-term success, those are just bonuses. They're not the basis. So offering them maybe will not hurt, but I don't think they're absolutely necessary to get like incredible blooms, at least from Phalaenopsis and Cattleyas and all of these very common orchids that you might find in garden centers and that are very, very showy. They're absolutely not necessary. They're more of a bonus. It's really up to you if you want to use them. I cannot give you advice on them because I don't use them, and I don't think I ever will because I'm already, you know, settled on my schedule and I like how things are going. I don't think I'm gonna use them. So if you're a beginner wondering if you really need to get all of the array, you don't. But if you want to, you know, if you have an offer, if you get a bonus, use it and see how it goes. it's just not really mandatory to have it. Foliar feeding. That is again another aspect that, at least when I was at the beginning, people were talking about it on forums and people were doing it. What this implies is that you dilute either a different type of fertilizer, either the fertilizer you have in some water, and then you spray the orchid. I will not insist too much on the subject because we do have a separate video on that, which I will add it down below if you have some time to watch it and delve into the subject deeper. It gets a little bit more complicated, but foliar feeding, in my opinion, again, it's not necessary. If you feel like you want to do it, you can do it. However, it is risky if you're growing your orchids in a normal living room that doesn't have fans everywhere and doesn't have proper ventilation. And even so, even with fans, even with what you think is proper ventilation and everything, you can still have rotting issues. It's a real problem in cultivation in our homes to have crown rot, stem rot, to have our orchid just rot and die off. I don't feel comfortable advising anybody to put their orchid at risk like that. It might never happen to you depending on your environment. It might happen after a year, or it might happen the first time you foliar feed. I don't know. I cannot tell you if or when rot will happen due to water pooling and standing on the structures of your orchid, which your orchid is not supposed to grow like this. It's supposed to grow like this naturally. But hey, we're in our homes, our living rooms. This is better, cuter, right? Easier for us to take care of. Won't go into the details as I was saying, but foliar feeding, again, it's something that you must research further and decide for yourself if you want to do. But if you're wondering if you can absolutely do without foliar feeding, you can. You can have the results that I have without foliar feeding. If you want to experiment with maybe one orchid, see how things do in your environment, absolutely experiment. It's very fun. Just take into account the risk of rotting, especially in home conditions. And if you're okay with just losing an orchid, maybe it's a double, maybe it's a keiki from one of your orchids, experiment. Absolutely, it's absolutely fun. But don't think you have to foliar feed, because otherwise your orchid will not put on this amazing show of blooms. It will. It absolutely will without foliar feeding. So that's how I stand on foliar feeding. I think it's way too risky for home growers and especially for beginners. Organic fertilizers. Many of you know I have never advertised them, never advocated for them. Moreover, I'm saying that I would not use organic fertilizers on orchids. Now, not because I have something against them, I use them exclusively in my garden. But see, my garden has isopods, earthworms, microbes that I don't even see and I don't even know of, but they're there. I don't know their name. I have a whole biodiversity system in my garden, and that's what these orchids have in nature as well. Even if they're not in the soil, they don't have earthworms, right? But they have bacteria, microbes that take care to break down organic material into chemical compounds that these orchids can feed on. If I give this orchid banana peels, it's not gonna eat the banana peels. It's not gonna happen. Organics need to be broken down in chemical formulas that orchids can recognize and upkeep. They can absorb chemical compounds in certain formulas in water. That's what they absorb, not leaf litter. It's a little different. In the garden, there are many little critters and microbes that break down all of these organics and transform them into these chemical compounds that other plants use as well. But we don't have such things in our pretty quote-unquote sterile orchid potting mixes. Overall, we do want to keep these as clean as possible just to make sure that they don't start to break down overly fast and overly much and acidify the environment and burn roots. We play by different rules in a home environment, so I will never advertise organic fertilizers that need to break down in order for orchids to get anything from them. So that's how I stand, but again, people use them. It's just hard for me to tell you what nutrients these organic fertilizers have and what benefit will they have for the orchid, or if they will spoil the medium or they will not. How will they break down? Will they break down? Will you have an overload of biological material in your pot? Nobody can tell you that. So personally, I don't use them. Again, it is up to you if you want to try them out. trying and experimenting is very fun, but I would much rather stick to the synthetic fertilizer, such as the MSU, that has all of the nutrients in their final form. It doesn't need to break down into anything. It doesn't need microbes to break down. I would stick to that for the potted orchids in your home rather than organic fertilizers, and just use those organic fertilizers in your garden, maybe even with houseplants and soil. Soils are much more full of microorganisms than the bark and the sphagnum moss we're using. Let's talk about flushing pots, which again was a major topic when I started out with orchids. Every 3 weeks or once a month, you needed to flush the pot of your orchid to eliminate the excess salt buildup from the fertilizers. I will have to tell you that I haven't flushed my pots since pretty much since I came to Cyprus 8 years ago almost. It's not something I do. It's not something I find necessary, and I do not have burnt roots. But this might have to do with how I fertilize, aka just following the label of the MSU, and also with the MSU, which is very well balanced in my opinion and doesn't actually create buildup. I have never experienced any signs of buildup or burned roots or anything on my orchid pots. I have been using tap water with it as well, combined with reverse osmosis water. And other than a little bit of calcium deposits from my tap water in years, which didn't damage anything, I didn't see any other buildup. Hence, it wasn't necessary to flush. Now, if you feel better and you can and you have time to flush, sure, flush. But if you're using your fertilizer correctly, and I can only vouch for the MSU because that's the only thing I'm using, if you use it correctly, you shouldn't need to flush. Even if the MSU actually tells you to flush once a month, that's just more to be safe, to be on the safe side. I haven't flushed. That's a little against the grain, and maybe this is, more of an intermediate grow tip. But hey, if my orchids are okay using the MSU, why shouldn't yours be, right? Mind you, I'm not using it with full tap water, and now I'm using the reverse osmosis water version of it. There is a version for well water as well, which I'm not entirely sure what is the difference, but maybe it has less calcium and magnesium. So I don't have buildup with the MSU. Not like this orchid has been potted in 2024. I potted this one. So a year ago at the beginning, there is no buildup on top, nothing, absolutely nothing. And I don't see like burned roots or anything. So flushes, I don't think they're necessary. Should you water your orchid pot before you fertilize? Which again, when I started, when I was a beginner, it was a big topic. No, you shouldn't. There is no need to. Fertilizers will not burn the roots when they're liquid, unless they're like super concentrated. You get that tomato fertilizer and you make a concentration of 5 to 10 times more. Yeah, that might be burning the roots in its liquid form. But an orchid fertilizer in its liquid form should not burn the roots. What happens is when that salt buildup forms, and depending on what some fertilizers contain, that's what's going to burn the roots, because it is a hygroscopic type of a salt which pulls water. So if it pulls water from the root, it desiccates the root. I had it happen with a fertilizer a long time ago. And there is another thing that can happen. Those salts can be pretty acidic, and in combination with a little bit of moisture from the root, again, it can burn it through the acidity. There are a few ways that maybe I'm not fully aware of, in which salt itself, undissolved, is so concentrated and so detrimental that it can damage roots, yes. With the MSO, I've never had it happen, but in its liquid form, it's not gonna happen. When the pot dries, that's when the damage happens. So there's really no point or logic into pre-soaking your orchid. Frequency and liberties, let's call them, of fertilizing. How often you should fertilize your orchid? Well, as often as the label tells you to. You can take some liberties. For example, I'm taking the liberty of not flushing the pot on the 4th watering of the month, like the MSU recommends, just to be on the safe side. That is the liberty that I'm taking after many years of experience. You can take the liberty of fertilizing twice a month, 4 times a month. You can do that as long as you don't use more quantity than you should. Follow the instructions. Whatever you do, don't use a bigger quantity than the label recommends at one go. Taking liberties is okay, but more for advanced growers, because there are so many fertilizers on the market that I really cannot tell you how they work and when you're gonna overdo it. So taking, sideways liberties with your fertilizer, I wouldn't recommend it at the beginning. Just follow that label and you should be good. Should you use different types of fertilizers depending if you want blooms or growth? No, absolutely not. It's not necessary. If you want to do it, but it's absolutely not necessary. I'm using only the MSU, which is not a bloom booster. It is an overall growth hormone fertilizer. It doesn't have hormones. It's a growth fertilizer, and I do not switch it when it's time to bloom or when I see flower spikes or when I see that my orchids have buds. Bloom boosters, as I like to call them, in my experience, don't do as much as you'd expect. You can, if you have it, if you bought it, use it. Use everything you bought. Don't throw anything away. Use them. But generally speaking, the next time you're buying fertilizer, I don't think it's necessary to buy a bloom booster to have incredible bloom shows. I personally don't. So if you like my bloom shows, well, learn that they're not made with bloom boosters. They're made with the overall high nitrogen, high potassium MSU. Usually the bloom boosters have a high phosphate number. My fertilizer has phosphate in the lowest. It's the lowest number in the macros. My orchids bloom. You don't need bloom boosters. Do you need slow release fertilizer? Now this is something I do actually use from time to time. You don't need it. If you have the soluble fertilizer and it's a full menu, that's great. But if you know you sometimes don't fertilize as often as you should, a slow release fertilizer will be so handy, and especially with the bigger orchids, like the bigger Phalaenopsis, the bigger Cattleyas, the older ones, because now you're not necessarily at the beginning, right? We started this series 6 years ago. Your orchids are already big and they're established. They need more food. Especially with those, adding a little bit of slow release fertilizer keeps you safe from deficiencies. And if 1 week your schedule is just so busy, you don't know what to do, you don't want to start to mix the water and you just want to water really fast, slow release fertilizer has your back. I'm one of those persons, and I really appreciate having some slow release fertilizer at hand. I don't use it with all of my orchids. With newer acquired orchids, tiny orchids, or recovering orchids, I don't really use it. It's not necessary. But with the big girls, the big phals, the big cats, or big dendrobiums, I use the slow release fertilizer. The MSU actually has slow release fertilizer as well, and it's a full menu again. It's gonna be great. Yes, you can combine them, the two fertilizers, as long as you don't put too much slow release fertilizer. I do combine them. But if you skip a week or two of the soluble fertilizer, no worries, the slow release has you covered. Just be careful to read on the tag how often you should refresh it. You should add more, because the timed release at some point depletes as well. You cannot have it there for 3 years and still give fertilizer. So just read how long it lasts, and maybe once a year. Usually I do it once a year. I put a few more beads and make sure that they go through the pot. I put them on top and then get a bamboo skewer and just work them in a little more, just to sit in the humid layer of sphagnum moss. And that's how I replenish the slow release fertilizer. It's not necessary to use it. It's really helpful if you don't have time, but it works absolutely great. And for some orchids, I'm sure you can absolutely just take the role of the water-soluble fertilizer. Absolutely, just as long as you refresh it when it needs to be refreshed. Every 6 months, 9 months, I'm not entirely sure when each fertilizer needs to be refreshed. We're almost to the end. Should you fertilize your orchids if they're in bloom, which is another hot topic that I've heard about when I was at the beginning? Yes, absolutely. Fertilizer has no saying in dropping of the flowers or anything in my experience. I am fertilizing my orchids all the time. I have slow release fertilizer for the big babies that releases fertilizer pretty much non-stop. I've never experienced any issues with fertilizing my orchids while they're in bloom. It's so hassling and it makes things not flow. For me, if I look at each orchid and prepare like 2 separate containers or 2 separate schedules of water. One is fertilizing and I fertilize these, and the other is not fertilized water and I don't fertilize these. A headache. Wild. No, I'm not gonna go through that. It's absolutely not important if you fertilize your orchid when it's in bloom. Don't even worry about it. Just don't overdo it with fertilizer in general, not only when your orchid is in bloom. Other than that, it does not matter. And the last note that I have here is let the orchid tell you. I've always said that and I always will. Even with fertilizer, your orchid will tell you if it's lacking something. But you have to know the signs. And here is an insider tip that you'll probably notice as well when you grow orchids. Your orchid will not tell you its deficiency like other plants. You know, you have those charts with, if you see veins on the leaf, the green veins and the discolored leaf, it means you need magnesium or whatever. Orchids will not do that. They will not turn different colors. They will not have light colored new leaves and the bottom leaves dark. They won't do that. They're different. They grow slow. They utilize their resources like no other plant because they're very well adapted to using small amounts of resources since they're epiphytic, the ones we grow mostly. They will not show you the deficiencies like that. Do not look for deficiencies on the leaves and stuff in the conventional way. In my experience, deficiencies will show as less growth, less blooms, less of everything. If your leaves start to get like tinier, they still look good, but they get tinier and tinier, that might be a fertilizer deficiency. And especially if you know you didn't fertilize or you used like conventional NPK fertilizer but without the trace elements, might be a fertilizer issue. If your orchid doesn't bloom like it used to create 15 blooms, now it makes 3. Still makes a flower spike, but it only makes 3 flowers. Might be fertilizer. Of course, look at the other things like light and everything and how well or frequent you water it if it has roots. But if everything looks okay and you know you're providing good care, if it only produces 3, 4 flowers and you know it can produce like 10, it could be a fertilizer issue. And also, these issues will not appear overnight. Again, they are very slow growing. They utilize the little nutrients that they have very, very, very well. They store nutrients even. So a deficiency will not appear in a month, 2 months, a year. Maybe at the 2-year mark, you're gonna start to notice a little something. 3-year mark, a little more. 4-year mark, it's already like, what is going on with my orchid? Because it's going downhill and I don't know what's happening. It has roots, it has everything it needs, but it's not performing that well. Look, people on the internet have 20 blooms on their phals, and mine has 3. What is going on? Fertilizer. So the effects of a deficiency are very misleading with orchids, in my experience. And that's why you see many people saying, oh, I grow my orchids for 2 years like this and it never needed fertilizer. Or, I've never fertilized my orchids in 10 years and still they're blooming. Yes, they're blooming. But are they blooming like abundantly or they're making 2, 3, 4 flowers? How are their leaves? Did you buy a Phalaenopsis that was gigantic and now it's kind of but it's still blooming? That's a sign of maybe not enough food, not enough fertilization of your orchid. So very misleading with orchids when it comes to deficiencies. So just keep that in mind. The orchid will tell you subtly. It's not gonna be like, hey, I want food, but it's gonna be like, you know what would be great today? To have 10 blooms. I'm gonna give you 3 this time. Maybe next time I'm gonna give you 10 if you treat me right, but I don't know, I'm gonna think about it. Pretty much that's how they work. So that is about it on fertilizer. I hope this helps you out and gives you more insight into how it is to like sustain an orchid and have it beautiful for years to come, and also be okay and comfortable caring for it. As you can see, I talk a lot about orchids, but I don't do a lot. I'm not the type to like overcomplicate myself with the whole array of all the fertilizers on the market. I don't do that. No, it's not needed. And long term, it's not sustainable for you to put so much effort, right? Just put the effort where it counts. So I hope this video helps you out. Hope you've enjoyed, and I hope you'll enjoy this series. If you have ideas of like topics of like hands-on experience-based topics for me to add to the series this year, let me know. I'm happy to provide what information you guys want me to provide. Thank you so much, rePotme, for sponsoring us yet another year. And yeah, it's gonna be a great year for orchids. I hope you'll have wonderful orchids this year. And with that said, I'll see you all next time. Bye.